Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's always good to follow poison ivy. Mr Speaker, expectations were very high in the budget that the government would finally, after years of being in denial, years of Nick Smith's photo opportunities and political stunts, the expectations were high that finally the government would do something about the housing crisis. First home buyers were watching with horror that the average Auckland house price cracked over $800,000 in the month before the budget. House prices in Auckland went up on average by $100,000 in the last 12 months. Renters watched as their rents in Auckland went up by 10% over the year because landlords were seeking a return on the investment that they'd made in skyrocketing house prices. There is a housing crisis, sir, and people desperately wanted action. The Reserve Bank Deputy Governor, Grant Spencer, publicly embarrassed the government by coming to this Parliament and saying that the government needed to do more, that they weren't doing enough, and they needed to do something about speculators. So the stage was set for this national government to finally do something meaningful about the housing crisis. And what we heard was a speculators tax. John Key announced at the National Party conference that he was going to change the rules to tax property speculators. And he announced a so-called, and not very bright line test that would tax speculators who bought a house and flicked it on within 2 years. And at first glance, this was remarkable that the government, who have been denying for the last 2 years that speculators were a problem in Auckland, at last announced some policy that was supposedly targeting speculators. But, sir, it didn't take very long for the commentators, the analysts and the general public to realise that this was a Clayton's tax response to rampant property speculation in Auckland. The so-called 2-year test is simply an invitation to speculators to buy a property, hold it for 2 years and flick it on. And Treasury analysis from 2010 indicates that the tax will be lucky if it nets as many as 1,000 speculators every year, sir, when there are 80,000 property sales every year. It'll be lucky if it nets $18 million a year when there are hundreds of millions, in fact billions of dollars in turnover every year from property speculation. John Shewan, formerly probably the most influential of the government's tax advisors, he commented that this measure won't curb skyrocketing house prices and it certainly won't do anything to deter property speculators. This knowledge seemed to finally catch up with Bill English, the Finance Minister, on Q&A last weekend when he was asked, do you think this tax measure will have any effect? And he said, I don't know. I have no idea if it will have any effect. What a damning statement, because what that means, Mr Speaker, is that the National Party used budget tax policy as a political stunt to announce policy that they have no idea whether it will have any impact at all on an issue which is probably the most pressing public policy issue of the day, and that is the urgent need to rein in the Auckland housing crisis that is making an entire generation of young New Zealanders generation rent. Young people in Auckland, good, hard-working New Zealanders, have no prospect of ever owning their own home in Auckland unless mum and dad are wealthy enough to write them a very big cheque. The second announcement on housing policy that we heard as part of the budget, Mr Speaker, was Nick Smith last week announcing that he had found 500 hectares of vacant government-owned land, zoned residential, that he was going to make available to property developers to put houses on. On the face of it, a perfectly sound idea. In fact, so sound, Mr Speaker, that the former Labor government 7 years ago did exactly the same thing, did an inventory of available government land, and what did the National Party of the day do? They derided it, they ridiculed it, they thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, and as soon as they got into office, they shut down that work and did nothing at all. And Nick Smith, in his mad, poll-driven panic, to try to come up with something to announce on housing before the budget, got his officials to go back to the shelf and dust off the work that Labor did 7 years ago. In the meantime, the national government had done nothing, zilch, nada, about the idea of developing vacant government land in Auckland. But on the surface, what seems to have been a perfectly simple idea has been completely stuffed up by Nick Smith, the Minister of Building and Housing, because he rushed out the announcement so fast that he didn't give his officials even the time to go and look at the parcels of land that were on his list. The list of parcels of land that were added up to the 500 hectares that he announced. He's the harem-scarum Minister of Building and Housing. If you want a good idea stuffed up, give it to Nick Smith, because that's what he did. He rushed it out. They didn't have time to actually go and look at the sites of land. They didn't even have time to pick up the phone and talk to the government agencies that own this land and ask them what they're doing with it and what they intend to do with it. So the 500 hectares of land that Nick Smith announced last week, it includes electricity substations, it includes the Mangere Lawn Cemetery, the SAS training base in Papakura, and the Otahu Fire Station, just to name a few examples. Now, Nick Smith in the House today denied that any of those things were on his land, but I guarantee this, Mr. Speaker, those public facilities were on lists that his officials prepared that led to him announcing 500 hectares of vacant government land. And, sir, Nick Smith has been extremely evasive and economical with the truth. On Monday, he denied categorically to the news media that the Hepburn Road electricity substation was on the list. Yesterday, he was in this House in Question Time promoting it as a site, and he tabled the land title for the substation. Now, I want to quote Nathaniel O'Connor, who was reported a year and a half ago when the Hepburn Road substation, when Nick Smith wants to build houses, when that substation blew up and caused a fire a year and a half ago, Nathaniel O'Connor, whose house is located 150 metres from the substation, was reported as saying, "Our lights flickered, then there was a really loud arcing sound, and a second after that there was a huge explosion. You could feel it inside your chest." Well, I think probably Nick Smith could feel a tightening in his chest as we've discussed this over the last couple of days in the House. And Bill English told the media, very reassuring, he said, Nick Smith said, "I presume the substation is not always exploding." So Bill English is very relaxed about it. Nick Smith thinks that building houses on an electricity substation is the answer to Auckland's housing crisis. If that's true, sir, we are in a lot more trouble than we thought previously. Things are a lot worse than we imagined. And we have 3 ministers of housing, actually, in this government. 3 ministers. Nick Smith, Bill English, and Paula Bennett. I think John Key should appoint 3 more, because since he announced those 3 ministers of housing, Auckland housing prices have gone up by $60,000 since those 3 ministers were announced. Sir, what have we got? A weak, half-hearted tax change to try to catch speculators. We've got a bizarre Nick Smith special, overcooked, underprepared, haven't done his homework, and both these announcements were rushed out. They are half-baked, scrambled together at the last minute in a panic, and their only objective is to make it look as if the government is doing something, anything, about the housing crisis in Auckland. But, sir, what we know is that these measures will have minimal impact. They won't make any difference for the generation of young New Zealanders who are locked out of the housing market. The first home buyers who simply want the dream that their parents and grandparents had in this country, and that is to own a home of their own. It won't help the kids in my electorate in West Auckland who are living in uninsulated garages because mum and dad can't afford to pay the rent and can't find a house anywhere. These measures will not be effective. What we need is a comprehensive crackdown on speculators. We need thousands of new affordable homes to be sold to first home buyers. This government is a crushing disappointment.
Mr. Speaker.